I fish, therefore I am. Scholars have long known that fishing eventually turns men into philosophers. Unfortunately, it is almost impossible to buy decent tackle on a philosopher's salary. I've always thought it'd be better if fishing turned men into Wall Street bankers, but that is not the case. It's philosophers or nothing. I became a philosopher at age 12, after a scant 6 years of fishing. One evening at supper, I looked up from my plate and announced, "I fish, therefore I am." Perhaps awed by this evidence of precocity in a young boy, my stepfather turned to my mother and asked, "Is there any more gravy?" Thus encouraged, I forgot about philosophy until I went off to college. The intellectual experience of life in a college dorm proved to be enormously stimulating, and soon I was engaged in a variety of scientific experiments. My research paper, Levitation, a roommate's response to a garter snake in his bed, caught the fancy of a psychology professor who invited me to join him in research on abnormal behavior in lesser primates. 3 months later, I made a remarkable discovery. If I pressed either the red or green buttons, nothing happened. But if I pressed the yellow, a bunch of bananas would drop out of a hole in the ceiling. And not caring much for bananas, I resigned my position and went in search of more serious, if not more fruitful, studies. While trying to decide on a major in college, I picked up a minor in philosophy, one Maylene Whipple by name, who could have passed for 25 any day of the week. It came as a shock to me to learn that the precocious Maylene was only 17, particularly since we had already engaged in discourse on the Hegelian dialectic, which is a felony in most states, even if committed by consenting adults. Maylene was amazed at my grasp of all the world's great philosophies, but less so at my grasp of her left knee, to which she responded with a karate chop that left my wrist bones in shambles. "Where'd you learn so much about philosophy?" Maylene asked, as I smiled suavely, clutching my throbbing wrist in an armpit. "From fishing," I said. "I started fishing at 6, and by the time I was 12, I was a full-fledged philosopher." "Pooh," she said. "Fishing can't turn you into a philosopher." "Oh, yeah?" I said. "How about Francis Bacon? How about him?" "What about Francis Bacon?" "Why, Bacon was nothing but a humble tailor until he took up fishing. 5 years later, he invented the scientific method and changed the course of history, despite never having landed a brown trout over 15 inches. "That's incredible," Maylene gasped. "Yes," I replied, "particularly when you consider there were plenty of really big brown trout around back then. The rule is, however, the worse the fisherman, the better the philosopher." I went on to explain to Maylene that Aristotle was known among his associates merely as one weird dude, until he met up with Plato. "Teach me to be a philosopher," Aristotle pleaded. Plato was immediately intrigued by the young man. "All right," he said, "let us begin with the basics: truth, justice, and how to bait a hook properly." Plato himself was so miserably inept at fishing that he eventually wrote The Republic, which is just about as bad as you can get when it comes to catching fish. Much to Plato's disappointment, The Republic was rejected by all the leading outdoor publications of the day. "That sounds pretty fishy to me," Maylene said. "Yes," I replied, "that is what I'm trying to tell you. All philosophy is pretty fishy underneath." "Underneath what?" Maylene asked. "I don't know that yet," I said. "I'm only a sophomore." And I was to remain a sophomore for several years, largely as a result of my study of philosophy at every lake and stream within 100 miles of the university. The one great universal question I sought to answer was why the angler always should have been here last week. After graduation, I studied with the great French existential philosopher Albert Camus, who told me that men must learn to live without hope. "Why is that?" I asked, disentangling a backlash. Taking advantage of the opportunity afforded by my backlash, Camus cast into the hole in which I had just had a nice strike. "Because that way, even if you don't catch any fish, you are never disappointed. You can always say you just enjoyed being out communing with nature on a nice day. Catching fish is not a matter of ultimate concern, unless, of course, we are talking about something over 5 pounds. The other great French existential philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre, once gave me an analogy to explain his concepts of being and nothingness. "This," he said, holding up a stick with one paltry 8-inch trout on it, "is being. That," he said, pointing to my empty creel, "is nothingness." I have studied the philosophy of Karl Marx at considerable length, and although I understand it has gained a number of followers in certain parts of the world, I personally have never found it appealing, perhaps because I disagree with one of his basic tenets. Marx believed that anglers should put all their bait in the same can, from which each would take according to his need. I, on the other hand, believe that each fisherman should dig and fish his own worms, although I am not averse to going sharesies on the fly book of a really good tire. William James's philosophy of pragmatism was more to my liking. Pragmatism is the philosophy of doing that which works, no matter what your mother might have told you. James, who had pretensions of being a dry fly purist, developed pragmatism from a simple experiment he performed one fishless day on a trout stream. He discovered that by making a slight modification in a number 18 caddis, he was suddenly catching monstrous brook trout. The James ploy, as the experiment came to be called, is still popular with some fishermen, even though the technical difficulty of attaching a night crawler to a number 18 caddis has never been solved. Ludwig Wittgenstein once explained logical positivism to me in a way that made it seem the answer to all the great philosophical questions, except what to do about spilled tackle boxes. Morris Lippenstein, a friend of mine in college, developed the philosophy of transactional redundance. It was a lousy philosophy, but Morris, on the other hand, was a terrific fisherman. Even now, his former professors still refer to him as Morris the Sophomore. The best philosopher I've ever known was a man by the name of Rancid Crabtree. Rancid lived in a little cabin in the woods behind our place when I was a boy, and since his time was free of all forms of gainful employment, he was able to devote himself to philosophy for up to 12 hours a day, not including cleaning and eating the catch. As a student of philosophy, I often sat at the feet of this great teacher, although I preferred a chair situated some distance upwind. Rancid was at his philosophical best while on a trout stream. "The water's a little murky for good fishing," I observed once. Rancid took a chaw of tobacco and studied the water. "Ain't nothing never just right to do what you wants to do when you wants to do it," he philosophized. "So you best just go ahead and do it anyways." "Spinoza?" I asked. "No, just a little tobacco juice dribbling down my chin." Although Rancid's philosophy seemed to be centered on fishing, it shaped much of my attitude toward life. Here is a sampling of his philosophy. "The two best times to fish is when it's raining and when it ain't. Smoked carp tastes just as good as smoked salmon when you ain't got no smoked salmon. There ain't no private property you can't fish if you knows how to hunker a spell with a man what owns it. You can't make fish bite just by wanting them to. Any time a man ain't fishing, he's frittering away his life." As I say, Rancid Crabtree's philosophy had an enormous influence on me. If it hadn't been for that, I might now be living a life adorned with the tawdry baubles of wealth, a life made sleazy and decadent by conspicuous consumption. I might even have turned out to be one of the jaded, beautiful people of the jet set. Other than those drawbacks, Rancid's philosophy has served me pretty well.